Thank you for being with us today. I'm happy to welcome you to the third CIS Colloquium, a colloquium series where we invite professors and researchers from EPFL and around the world working on different aspects of intelligent systems to discuss the current state of the art. We previously hosted Professor Goldwasser of the University of Berkeley, California, and Professor Wert of Mines Paris in France. Today, we are delighted to host Professor Nagpal of Harvard University. Before going further, I would like to thank Professor Nagpal and her team, Professor Isbert and the CIS team for organizing this event today. I will now give the floor to Professor Isbert, who is the director of the Biorobotics Laboratory at EPFL and a member of the CIS steering committee, for the introduction of our speaker today.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Jan. And it's really a wonderful pleasure to introduce Radhika for this talk today. I think there could not be a better start to the semester. I was just explaining to Radhika at the beginning of the semester, so we are in a new field now, a new time. And it's super exciting to have you, Radhika, as a speaker.
Thank you.
I think we are very lucky because Radhika is very well known as a roboticist. She's a Kavli professor of computer science at Harvard University. And interestingly, she's also a founding member of the Wyss Institute there. And she has many awards, a very beautiful TED talk that I recommend that you listen to. And I think there could not be a better speaker for our Center of Intelligent Systems, because Radhika has this beautiful, both scientific and engineering work in between robotics and biology, especially on social insects. I think we'll hear about that today. And I find it's really beautiful work, as mentioned, both scientifically and from an engineering point of view. So it's super exciting to have you here. Thanks a lot for taking the invitation, even during your sabbatical. So thanks a lot for taking the time. And just a bit of practical things. So it's a webinar. So unfortunately, you only see us, Radhika, but all the people are there listening, I hope. And for people listening, please don't hesitate to already type your questions during the talk. So we use a Q&A facility, not the chat, the Q&A of Zoom. So type your questions there, and at the end, Jan and me will handle the questions for Radhika. So it's a bit less personal than seeing us face to face, but for practical reasons, this webinar format is what works best. So yeah, I'm so much looking forward to your talk, Radhika, and the screen is yours. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I love giving, like I said, I love giving talks to the EPFL crowd, just because that sort of mix of science and engineering is so fundamentally present, and this center is really about that. So thank you for inviting me. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you about the collective intelligence of a particular social insect, the army ants, and tell you about some robots that they inspire. And so in my lab, let me make sure. All right, so in my lab, all right, the area or the theme that we study is collective intelligence. So how is it that large groups of individuals with very simple and local interaction rules can cooperate to achieve globally complex behavior? So as a computer scientist and roboticist, how do you study collective intelligence? So I always like to start by showing you one of my favorite times, which is me on my 45th birthday, trekking about 10 miles a day, 90-degree heat, 100% humidity in Panama, hunting for army ants. And army ants are this spectacular example of collective intelligence. Millions of them work together, and there's no leaders in charge. But because they're nomadic, they make their entire nest out of their own body, and they create these crazy bridge structures to get over rough terrain. And it's just this amazing system to study, and the subject of the talk today. But army ants are really just one example of collective intelligence. I like to think of cells as also having collective intelligence. So if you think cells with identical DNA, thousands to millions of them cooperate to create amazing structures that are not only just amazing in their structure, but can also self-repair. And even at these small scales, you see collective intelligence, and you can see collective intelligence at large scales. So these are termite mounds that can be anywhere from like 2 to 10 meters large, created by tiny insects that are only centimeter scale. So really, this collective intelligence can create artifacts that are large and self-repairing and like organisms of themselves. And of course, all of us know of the collective intelligence of fish, for example, or bird flocks, how you can not only just get structure formation, but you can get dynamics that is incredibly beautiful, evading predators and forming bait balls. So these systems are fascinating to anyone who observes them, but I think they're, of course, very fascinating to biologists and engineers alike. And I think what is, of course, immediately striking to all of us is that each individual is so tiny compared to the massive phenomena that they're creating. It seems almost impossible that they can coordinate so well when any individual ant or any individual fish can't really know what's going on the other edge of the swarm. And yet they do coordinate well. In fact, they coordinate so well that we forget that there are individuals at all, and we start to think of collective as if the collective was a single agent. And it's really this collective autonomy, this sense in which the collective has become an entity of its own, that I think we find really intriguing. But the other thing I find really intriguing is the algorithms by which this collective autonomy arises. And as far as we know, there are no leaders that are orchestrating this whole behavior. Instead, somehow this incredible level of collective intelligence emerges purely from many individuals interacting using really simple rules. And those many simple rules, when run together by these large decentralized groups, results in this intelligence. So it's really not only that you have collective autonomy, but that it arises through self-organization. So of course, to a biologist, the central question is, how does this collective self-organization work? But to an engineer, of course, the question is, can we build our own? So if we could understand the rules that lead to this natural collective intelligence, could we then make our own artificial intelligence that operates based on these same principles? So be able to create programs that behave this way, but also robotic artifacts that derive from this natural system. So why would you want to do that? I think there's lots of reasons why we might, from an engineering and applications point of view, want to understand collective intelligence. First of all, any robotic application that you think of, whether it's warehouses or agriculture or environmental monitoring or construction or even satellites, you're going to think of multiple robots cooperating together. Parallelism is sort of an inherent thing that we always need. So if we are going to do this, then we want to be able to effectively program such systems to exhibit coherent collective behavior. And I think, the one that's right on our horizon is what happens when you have millions of self-driving cars on the road. It's going to look like a lot of ants on a trail. So hopefully we're able to program those systems in meaningful ways. But also in the future, we may be able to shrink the size of our robotic artifacts. And if we can get closer to cells, we can even think of more interesting applications or other kinds of new applications like programmable smart materials, getting closer to what tissues do. And then our artifacts don't even look like a robot, but really still have this concept of collective intelligence. And I think for me, in addition to sort of the potential for future applications, I'm also just really interested in the fundamental question of how complexity of this sort arises from these simple individuals. So if we look at cells and ants and fish, would we find that there are universal principles that extend from cells and ants and fish all the way to robots? And today I'll actually show you some examples where perhaps they even extend the other way, where inorganic materials and physics is actually showing us self-organization that we can see all through living systems into artificial AI. And I think that by trying to emulate examples in biology, which is primarily what my lab does, we can gain insights into these potentially universal principles, or at least powerful principles. So that's what my group works on. We are inspired by biology to build robot collectives of many kinds, and my lab is particularly known, especially for the Kilobots, the 1,000 robot swarm, and also for our work on robots and collective construction, the Termes robots inspired by termites. But we have lots of different projects going on. And a big part of this sort of synthetic version of collective AI is that we want to be able to match the kind of capabilities that biological collectives have. So from these natural systems, we want to learn what are the rules that lead to this behavior, but we're also really interested into insights into robot morphology. So how is it that the embodiment of AI also enhances the collective intelligence? And one of my former students, Kirsten Peterson, likes to call this collective embodied AI, and I think that's really captures what we're excited about. We also worked very closely with biologists through field studies to better understand many of the open questions of how these natural systems work in the wild. And we also work on the mathematics and theory to understand how these rules lead to complex collective. And it's really through this interdisciplinary approach that involves all of these disciplines and scientists and engineers and theorists from these different disciplines that we try to better understand how self-organization works. So today, I wanted to tell you about one recent project in my group, inspired, as I said, by the spectacular collective intelligence of army ants. And today's talk is actually going to be the story of 5 people, 3 roboticists and 2 biologists, who took a trip to Panama in 2016 to observe this amazing system in person. And so you can see there's me, Mike, who actually designed the Kilobots and now is a faculty member at Northwestern, Helen, who's a McDonald Fellow and a biologist, Simone Garnier, who's a faculty at New Jersey Institute of Technology, and Melinda Malley, who's a recently graduated PhD from my group. So it'd be sort of the story of 5 people. All right, so I want to start with a movie that sort of repeats a little bit of what you saw before, but more about army ants. So army ants are truly the queens of self-assembly and reconfiguration. And together with other insect species like fire ants and weaver ants, they do this incredible amount of self-assembling structures to gain control of their environment. So they're constantly forming and unforming structures to solve problems in their environment. Army ants form bivouacs and they reassemble them. They're nomadic, so they reassemble them every time they migrate, but they also create these crazy bridge structures to get over rough terrain that they don't like. And even though the bridges might get damaged or destroyed by annoying humans, they reassemble them within minutes. So it's just this rapid formation of structures. In fact, they reassembled an entire bivouac. They can reassemble an entire bivouac, which is what we found out when we accidentally stepped on one. So although we don't totally fully know the rules by which this self-assembly works, we are able to make artificial setups, and biologists are beginning to reveal some of the hidden properties. But for me, I'm also just really amazed, pause this for a second, really amazed at the details of these ant self-assemblies. If you look at the close-ups of how these ants are connected to each other, how they can just freely walk over each other, it's really this living, breathing, soft material, almost like an organic tissue. And this really makes it another aspect of this remarkable system. All right, so how do army ants actually assemble these amorphous and messy bridges, and why do they make these bridges in the first place? So I want to start by telling you a bit about Simone Garnier and his lab's research that preceded our Panama trip. So Simone and his colleagues noticed that many bridges form when there's a detour in the path. So as humans, we totally understand this, something goes around and we cut across. But in this case, they cut across by creating a bridge out of their own body. So here you can see a case where there's sort of a V and there's a bridge across. Here's another example. And I showed you this video where actually there was a long detour and the ants had formed a bridge in the middle. And so to study this, he and his team studied natural bridges, but they also designed an artificial V setup where you could actually control the angle of the detour and sort of videotape and sort of properly study all of the aspects of this bridge formation. And they made some really interesting discoveries. So the first sort of discovery that they made, or the main discovery that they made, was that the self-assembly was incredibly adaptive. So under low traffic conditions, ants would just take the long route. No bridges would form at all. So it's only under high traffic condition that a bridge forms. And even then, the bridge width, so how big a bridge you have and where it's located, is actually related to the traffic itself. So more traffic, you get wider bridges to accommodate it. So it's congestion adaptive. And finally, if the traffic dies out, or if they artificially stop the traffic from coming in, the bridge gets up and leaves, which is an amazing concept, that the structure itself can dissolve and be reused again in some future endeavor. So to me, this is an amazing example of adaptive self-assembly or adaptive architecture. So you make a structure only when needed, you make a structure exactly as big as needed, and then you undo it when it's not needed anymore. I think for all of us, like imagining your nearest bridge doing that. So I think of Harvard Bridge, if it could expand during peak hours and then disappear completely from view when nobody is walking, that would just be a mind-boggling concept. And yet that's what the army ants are actually doing. So I like to think of it as these 3 T's: traffic, terrain, and temporary. Now, globally, we can see this behavior, but locally, we don't really know what the mechanism is. How do ants decide to become part of the bridge? But there is a hypothesis that biologists have put forth that a very simple behavior might be enough. So the idea is, imagine that you're an ant and you're walking along and life is good, but then there's congestion and other individuals start stepping on you. So if they step on you, you basically decide to become stationary and become a bridge element, or you go into bridge state where you're stationary. And then you stay in this state as long as people are walking on you, ants are walking, sorry, not people, but ants are walking on you, or or you're being grabbed by others. But if that's not true, then after some delay, you can actually leave. And so the top sort of part of the arrow leads to bridge formation. So if there's congestion, bridges form. But if the bridge actually reduces congestion, then that might limit the size of the bridge. So this is how a sort of size bridge might form. And then the bottom is, you know, when there's not needed, then individuals can start peeling off and the bridge actually dissolves. And so this, they actually use this hypothesis to explain even more complex dynamics that were happening in this system. So it's a really fun paper to read and I highly recommend it. But I think the takeaway is a very simple local hypothesis can lead to this very complex global behavior. The second observation that I'm going to make is something that biologists take for granted, but is interesting for roboticists, I think, and is something I alluded to before. And that is that the bridges that army ants make are very amorphous and messy. So it's very unlike how we might think of lattices and trusses in human bridge construction. And of course, lattices and trusses are really good. They have great strength and material efficiency. So there's a reason to use them. But army ants are doing something very different. And there's 2 interesting takeaways from looking at this sort of amorphous and messy structure. One is that the assembly is very fast because ants don't need to precisely dock and form with each other. And 2, the resulting system is like this fibrous compliant material. So even if the environment changes a bit or you have an unstructured environment, it can fit into these messy environments and maybe even deal with a lot of problems through compliance. So instead of building a perfect lattice structure, we're building a sort of messy, inefficient structure, but we're building it fast and it's adapting. And this makes a lot of sense if your goal is to build temporary structures in your environment to solve problems. And I just want to mention there is actually an example of human construction that looks like this. And that's when we build flood barriers with sandbags. So sandbags can be put together imprecisely. We're building a temporary structure and thousands of unskilled individuals can work together to make it happen. And so that's one case where human construction is closer to the goals and the methods that we're seeing in army ants. But I think it tells us something about, you know, how differently we can think about self-assembly than maybe cellular automata kind of ideas would have told us. All right, so that's Simone's work. But imagine that in the future, if we could create a robot swarm that could do what army ants could do. So if it's a difficult terrain, you self-assemble bridges or ramps or chains or towers as needed to solve the problem. And when the task is done, you just disassemble and move on. Maybe you could even create other temporary structures like shelters or storage structures, the way army ants create bivouacs or food caches. And this is the vision that inspired the Eciton Robotica project, jokingly, adding another artificial species to the genus Eciton. And this was the subject of Melinda Malley's PhD thesis, which she just defended in June. So to start this project, we decided to focus on two questions that directly derive from the observations that I made of Simone's work previously. So first, can we design soft robots, or can we design robots that climb over each other to self-assemble soft and compliant structures, the way the amorphous, in some ways building off of the principles of this amorphous and messy construction that army ants do? And secondly, can we design robot rules or self-assembly rules so that robots build temporary and adaptive structures, so build only when needed and recover the resources when you're done? And here, maybe start from the local hypothesis that biologists have of how this might occur. And ultimately, the goal of this project, of course, is to move us closer to realizing the vision of more highly capable robot swarms. So moving beyond sort of wheeled robots in simple settings to climbing robots that can do amazing things. But a second motivation is also to use this synthetic system as a way to understand the collective of army ants, collective intelligence of army ants. So, understanding the power of it. So for example, you could think of the first part as looking at the mechanical intelligence. So what are the advantages of really changing the way of physically building your collective, so that what advantages does that give you? And think of the second question as addressing the computational intelligence. So do these hypothesized rules actually work, and would they work in robots the way they work in ants? So both the mechanical and the computational intelligence were part of this project and part of Melinda's thesis. All right, so of course, our group is not the first to think of creating self-assembling robot swarms inspired by ants. In fact, there's a long history of work in swarm robotics and reconfigurable modular robots that we build on, and EPFL has made major contributions in this area. And one of the pioneering projects was the SwarmBots project, where there were simple sort of wheeled robots that had flexible grippers, and together the robots could form pulling chains or barriers and now do much more interesting activities than any individual would be able to do by itself. And this system mainly focused on self-assembly in 2D, but several groups then worked on modular systems that could self-assemble in 3D. And I've chosen two examples that I think are representative, two of my favorite examples of many. So on the left is the Atron system, which has these round modules that sort of flip over other modules and grab using hooks. And on the right is an M-block system where it's really sort of lattice-like, and the robots move by jumping in the environment and attaching using magnets. So we have sort of flipping and grabbing and jumping and attaching. So you have to climb and attach to do in 3D. All right, so as we can see, both of these systems sort of focus on geometric tessellations or lattices, and some groups also do trusses. And there's lots of really good reasons to do that. As I said, there's strength and material efficiency, but also if you're building rigid robots, you're kind of building some sort of polygon to begin with. So a geometric tessellation is sort of an obvious thing to do. Also on the algorithmic side, if you have a lattice system, you can use ideas from the long history of cellular automata to think about algorithms. And a lot of the focus here has been on top-down self-assembly. So you give me a shape and I compile out cellular automata-like rules that lead to the shape that you want. So the focus in this sort of 3D space has really been very different from what we see in the army ants. And choosing a lattice also constrains the mechanical design. So it means that climbing and attachment is a very precision-driven activity. You have docking points and you have to exactly attach where it is, which is also another difference. So to start to explore this more amorphous and messy structures of army ants, we need to sort of change the way we think about self-assembly and the way we think about climbing and attachment. And here we can take inspiration from other fields in robotics and also from biology. So there's a ton of work in climbing robots where you're climbing without lattice points or you're climbing over materials, and a lot of work in how you might attach to different materials, how you might climb in multiple orientations and transition from one orientation to another. I've put here some of the examples that actually inspired our work. But most climbing robots cannot actually climb over each other. And there's both a material issue, maybe what you're climbing over isn't what your body is made out of, and sometimes there's a resolution issue, is that you're climbing, you know, you might just get tangled up in other robots over another. So there's still, you can't directly translate these ideas to self-assembly, but they give us a lot more sources of ideas. And finally, the sort of third piece of inspiration is looking at biology. So if you think about natural climbers, they're often quite soft, and sometimes they're fully soft, like slugs and caterpillars can actually climb over each other, which is amazing. They're some of the most amazing climbers. And of course, in our own field, we're also starting to understand the advantages of, sorry, like trying to move the video out of my way. Understanding the advantages of soft robotics. So this is an example of a soft hand with soft fingers. And actually the hardware that I'll show you is directly inspired by the finger structure of these hands. So we can really derive inspiration from all different kinds of places to think about this new world of amorphous messy structures. So I'm gonna start by showing you some of, oh, whoops. This is again. So I'm going to start by showing you some of the hardware. I feel like I missed, there we go. Sorry about that. By showing you the hardware system that Melinda designed as part of her thesis. And it's really a creative piece of work where she brought inspiration from a lot of different systems that I wouldn't have imagined. And of course, as you can see, the robot looks nothing like an ant. And so it's not so much replicating ants, but replicating the idea of amorphous self-assembly, amorphous and soft self-assembly. All right, so here you can see the Eciton Robotica robot in its natural and very green habitat. And it has 2 feet and it has a soft body with cables, and it moves by flipping. So the behavior is very simple. You flip your body over until your foot hits the surface, and then you grab, and then you flip your body again. And the cables are basically the actuation by which this happens. Now, the interesting thing about flipping is that it allows movement in any orientation. And it also allows movement between orientations. So it's almost as if the foot is searching through space to find the next orientation, and really allows for transitions. And the soft compliant body is extremely important as you go through these transitions. This allows the body to compress into any configuration without having to have any reasoning involved. So it has a very simple behavior. So this robot and the robots I'll show you are still limited to 2D. So we haven't added steering yet, but at the same time, it is a soft robot that is completely untethered and completely autonomous. And this was shown in IRUS 2017. So the next question is, how do the robots attach to surfaces, and how do they attach to other robots? So Melinda designed a gripper that can attach to Velcro surfaces. And this became the basis of the idea that you could have grippers and skins. So she designed a gripper, let me see. So the idea you have grippers and skins. So she designed a gripper that hooks into Velcro, and then the robots have a Velcro skin. And the gripper works by these corkscrews that can screw and wind into loops, and this actually can wind into foam surfaces as well, and then you unwind to let go. And so you can actually make a really secure connection between the robot and its environment. And the key is now that a robot can actually grip anywhere along the body of another robot, and there's no need for precise alignment. And we're still working on making this robot climbing more reliable, but it is a very flexible idea, and there are many different configurations in which you can climb. So here you can see another example. We didn't really expect it to climb over the structure, but we still have some work to do. And while we're working on making this more reliable, the gripper itself is actually very strong in both tension and peel, which is important because you're forming structures in many different ways. So here you can see multiple robots. You could actually, one gripper can hold the weight of almost 12 robots. So it's really, really quite a good system. Right. Sorry, using Zoom sometimes is not quite, I'm not quite as good at it as I hoped. All right. All right. So the next third part of this, so we can climb, we can attach, and the third part that we wanted to implement was the ability for robots to actually use the state machine that I described that army ants do. So can I detect if I'm walked on? And so here we want to have some simple form of communication where you can detect that you're being walked on. And Melinda came up with the idea to use vibration. And vibration, of course, is very common in the insect world. It's often called stridulation, but individuals will create vibration through a surface to detect or tell other individuals that something is going on. And here we're actually passing vibrations through the soft body so that other robots can detect that they're actually being grabbed or walked on. And so this is a really simple idea, but in the future we could use the vibration to even communicate more complicated messages between physically interacting. It's almost like having a mechanical touch sensor with some communication capabilities. All right. So with these three pieces, we have a robot that basically gets close to what we need. We need climbing so that robots can climb over each other. We need attachments so that they can self-assemble. And we need some way for them to detect whether they're being walked on. So I want to end this section by just showing you some of our very recent experiments with two fully autonomous robots being able to run the full sort of state machine, but of course it's only two robots, so we'll have to see basically a limited amount. So here we have two fully autonomous robots. We'll call this guy robot 1 and this one robot 2, and they're walking along in their world, and then at some point robot 2 will get stepped on by robot 1. Slowly, here we go. And this causes robot 2 to go into a bridge state. It stops trying to move and basically stays where it is. It's a little hard to see from the LEDs. And then robot 1 is able to climb over this bridge and leave. And then robot 2 eventually decides that it can move again. So this is dissolving the bridge. And then of course it escapes from our robotic confines. And this was very exciting because it was our first fully exhibiting the algorithms, but I'll also show you a bunch of bloopers. Just about the many things that can happen instead. So for example, sometimes they don't collide at all, so they just move along the box and we don't actually get the experiment that we hoped for. And clearly you need more robots to have a statistically more things happening. Sometimes the collision happens on the upper surface, so now it's a much more difficult sort of climbing goal that has to be completed, but can still work with some reliability, though not always. So bridge formation has been very reliable. What's been a little bit less reliable has been bridge dissolution. So clearly the other robot shouldn't have moved, but it did anyways. So we're still working on the delays. Here you can see another example. And again, we have this problem of the bridge trying to leave too soon. And sometimes, you just fall. And I think one of the really cool things about the system is seeing all of the different dynamics and potential for recovery in these systems that are soft without precision with these soft bodies. I think we're opening the space to a lot more complex, but perhaps a lot more robust behavior in the future. All right. So I've shown you sort of where we are with the hardware with these two robots. And I want to show you a little bit about the simulation side of this. So if we have two robots, how do we understand the behavior of many robots together? So to understand this, we created simultaneously a simulation, and it's a very abstract model of a flipping robot. And just sort of briefly, the robot flips, and we looked at an environment that was really inspired by Simone's sort of V detours. So in this system, the robot moves by flipping. If it gets stepped on, then we simulate the idea of detecting it through vibration, and it turns into a bridge state, which is indicated by this lower color. And I should mention that the implementation of the work that I'm going to show you was done by Lucy Hole, who is a EPFL master's student who spent time in my lab. It was a really amazing experience. And also the work of Bahar Hagigat, who is a PhD student at EPFL, who helped with the hardware of the robot. So if you want to read about this, our recent ICRA paper actually shows both of the computational and mechanical intelligence pieces. And it was fun to have my first all-female cast paper in my experience, which was really great. And thanks to EPFL for supporting that. All right, so let me show you a video of what this looks like, the simulation looks like. So if you have really low traffic, no bridges form at all. And so this is a little bit higher, and sometimes you have maybe a small bridge form stochastically. So the traffic sort of looks very uniform, but it's a little bit bursty. So there's some noise in it. Now, if you increase the traffic, you start to get bridges form. But what's interesting is that the size of the bridges is sort of self-limiting. We actually see self-limiting behavior. So as the bridges become larger, the traffic starts to smooth out, and then the bridges stop growing. So we're actually achieving this sort of congestion behavior. And if you stop the traffic, in most cases, we also get bridge dissolution. So the rule that we're running is a slight modification of this. So Lucy's thesis talks about some of the things that we had to modify to make this work. But the dynamics is something that you really aren't predicting at all. So it's really fun to watch who's going to leave first, and we're not always very good at predicting how the system is going to dissolve. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that this behavior is very flexible. So you don't have to just think about sort of V detours. You can also think about ramps or multiple complex terrain, and you would see these structures forming and unforming freely. And that's actually what we see with the army ants. There are often multiple bridges in different ways. Some of them are more like ramps, some of them are ramps up and ramps down. So we can it really does seem like this behavior replicates the interesting pieces. But maybe most importantly, we were able to replicate the high level concepts of that they were seen in the army ant bridges, that in low traffic or easy terrains, there's no bridges. In higher traffic, you start to see more bridges that relate to the size of that relate directly to the congestion. And we also observed cases where you have an unstable pileup. So the traffic or terrain is so high that you immediately have this backup. And we actually observed that in army ants too, but army ants turn around and take another path and they leave your experimental thing. Whereas here, you know, the simulation crashes. So that's another way of leaving the system. But with this, we were able to create a phase diagram of thinking about this, so sort of plotting the phase space of this behavior. So on the left, the y-axis at the top is low traffic, and at the bottom is very high traffic where they're so close that any little thing will cause a collision. And at the x-axis, we have the terrain. So here is sort of the very narrow and constricted terrain, and here is the very wide terrain. So you can think of this corner as being the congested corner where things should happen, bridges should form. And that's exactly what we see. What we see is stable bridge formation in this region. And with bigger bridges, that's sort of what the numbers are here, bigger bridges sort of in this corner getting smaller further away. And in the other extreme, no bridges form. So it's just too easy terrain and no collisions happen. You can run it for forever and nothing's going to happen. And in between, we see this stochastic region where, depending on the burstiness in the traffic, sometimes a bridge might form or sometimes it might not form. And here you can also see the unstable pileup. But this pretty much replicates the sort of overall behavior that was seen with the very small number of experiments that could be done in the real system. Now we can really investigate the whole phase space. And one of the things that I find really interesting about this phase space is that this phase space is actually a familiar phase space to anybody who studies jamming physics. So if you think that you have a funnel and you're pouring rice, right? When is the funnel going to get clogged? So maybe if the constriction is very small, so it's a tight funnel, or if you're pouring a lot of rice at the same time. So really, here is where you get sort of jamming, and here is where you don't. And so suddenly we see this way in which army ant bridge self-assembly is actually very directly related in living material exhibiting properties that are like inorganic materials. And there are some differences, but I think this correspondence is really interesting and something that we might see in many animals that collectively are using materials in their environment, and that they are exploiting the physics of the situation as well. So for me, that's a really interesting thing to sort of understand how we're also relating to material properties that we might understand in other fields of mechanical engineering. All right, so I've shown you sort of the two pieces of the Eciton Robotica project, looking at the mechanical intelligence, how we can build amorphous self-assembly, but this is just one example of many kinds of designs that we could come up with. And also some work on the self-assembly rules, which I think is really showing that these rules have the power that we believe they might have. But this is really only the beginning of what we can do. If you know, there are many different kinds of bridges that they form, but there's also other structures that form. So here are some examples actually from weaver ants that form structures like cantilevers or towers or chains in order to reach other things. And so the question is, could we build those kinds of structures? Could the same robots and same rules actually achieve those kind of structures? And these are hand-assembled structures that I'm showing here, but clearly the hardware sort of lends us to this idea that maybe if we could get really good at climbing over things, we could actually build multiple different kinds of structures if we understand the rules that lead to them. So I think there's just a lot of space to address the two questions in many different ways and to look at much broader space. I hope people will be excited about taking different stabs at this. Okay, so for the remainder of the talk, I wanted to shift from telling you about robots to telling you about biology and some of the new biology work that is happening here. And I'm going to start by telling you about the work of Helen McCreary, who's a James McDonough Fellow and is currently spending her time in my lab. And this is joint work with Simone. So I showed you the V-shaped bridges that, that Simone studied, but there's actually lots of other kinds of bridges that can be formed. So I'm going to show you other kinds of bridges that can be formed where the adaptation is happening constantly. So they're constantly remaking the bridge to deal with the environment. So I'm going to show you a sped up video of the experiments that Helen did. And the idea is that we trick army ants onto this apparatus, which you can see here next to Helen, to build their trail over this apparatus. And in the beginning, the apparatus is nice and smooth, so they have a nice trail. But then we start to trick them, which is every 30 seconds, Helen increases the gap in the trail by 1 millimeter. And so every 30 seconds, she's adding 1 millimeter to it until we arrive at a length of 3 centimeters. And then she starts decreasing the gap. So every 30 seconds, she's decreasing the gap by 1 millimeter. And what you can see is amazing is that this bridge is constantly being reassembled and disassembled in real time. So it's actually expanding the number of ants and decreasing the number of ants. And sometimes it breaks, but for the most part, this bridge is constantly being adjusted to the environment, very much in real time. And what's interesting is that this behavior, the last ant does actually eventually leave. What's amazing in this behavior is that it might actually be a result of exactly the same hypothesis as before. So if you think about it, if I stretch the bridge and it's overstretched, then maybe this causes congestion. Maybe it's harder to walk over this bridge. And as a result, more ants join, thus increasing the length of the bridge or increasing the individuals in the bridge. And if the bridge is slack, then it looks a little bit like this V, where there's some individuals who maybe aren't getting stepped on and they start to leave. And so that makes the bridge less slack. So in real time, you're seeing both formation and dissolving happen. And the end result is that you have this living material that is responding to being over tensioned or over slacked by adding or removing materials. So it's really quite amazing. And there are other living materials that actually exhibit this behavior too. So if you think of cell tissues during wound repair, and you think of the wound as the gap, there's actually sort of interesting analogies between these two behaviors that haven't yet been explored. So in the process of looking at this system, Helen also discovered a really interesting thing that we had not expected. And that is that these bridges actually exhibit hysteresis. So if you look at a given gap size, so here we're looking at sort of 10 millimeters, you can see that the size of the bridge, the volume, and both the number of ants actually differ considerably if the bridge was formed through a contracting process or through an expanding process. And this idea that you travel one direction during expansion and another direction during back is sort of a classic hysteresis curve. And of course, we colored it to look like the classic hysteresis curve. And this shows that the bridge has structural memory of how it was actually formed. So it's not just responding to the environment, but it's actually responding to its own history. And this is a very exciting discovery because it actually tells us several things. For one, it also, again, brings us correspondence between living materials and inorganic materials that exhibit hysteresis. So we can start to understand how these systems are exploiting their own physics. The second is that the hysteresis actually puts a lot of more constraints on ant models. And so actually the very simple state machine that I showed you is not sufficient by itself to explain hysteresis or produce hysteresis. So this allows us to try to understand what are the more complex or details of this behavior going in. And finally, I think for me, what's interesting is also gives us new insights into the complexity of army ant adaptation. So in engineering, we use hysteresis on purpose. So if you think of a thermostat, you add hysteresis so that when the temperature is right on that border, the heater doesn't just switch on and off constantly. We add hysteresis to prevent oscillations, to dampen oscillations. What if that's why we're exhibiting, or why hysteresis has evolved in this system, is that you don't want to constantly have the bridge being remodeled. You want to only remodel it, when things get tough. And so you have some hysteresis that prevents you from constantly remodeling this bridge. And you're sort of damping, actually. So you're both self-healing, but you're also damping the self-healing behavior in some way. And I think these are just really interesting things that we're beginning to understand about the complexity of bridge formation. All right, so that's one piece. And then I wanted to show you one last piece. So the story of the last person in our set, Mike Rubenstein. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Oh, barely close. All right. So I showed you that lots of work on bridges, but army ants self-assemble more than just bridges. And one of the most impressive structures that they create is the nest itself, or the bivouac, which houses the queen and the larva and food caches. So I want to finish by mentioning a new project in Mike Rubenstein's lab at Northwestern that he's conducting with Simone Garnier to actually try and capture videos and images of the bivouac forming in real time. And here you can actually see Mike next to a bivouac. And Mike discovered this bivouac when we were following the trails in Panama, and he wanted to find where the bivouac is, so he stood on this log in order to sort of see further where the bivouac is. But it turns out the log was rotten and the bivouac was in the log. And so his foot went straight through, luckily we were wearing boots, straight into the bivouac itself. And we destroyed the bivouac, which made Mike very upset. He was very sad to destroy nature in this way. However, to our surprise, within less than half an hour, the bivouac had completely reassembled. So this is actually the reassembled bivouac. And so inspired by really this outcome, both it gave Mike and Simone the idea that maybe they could create an artificial setup to study how the bivouac forms from scratch. And I'm going to show you a video of their first experiments in this space, which were really in 2D. So this is another species. Well, I guess I didn't mention the species, but there are multiple species of army ants. Here you can see multiple bridges being formed on this trail. So this is their 2D setup. Basically looks like an ant farm, the kind in which you might observe ants as a kid. And you can start to see how the bivouac actually forms. So the ants are being pushed in through this pipe here, and they actually start to form these chains. So bivouacs are really formed through chains that are coming down that link together to form walls. And really, this is just another insight into what I was saying, like how do they build chains? we can start to see the structure of which is happening. So in this system, it was 2D and a camera. In this system, it's 2D and a camera, but recently Mike has designed a system where they have a 3-dimensional box and the camera is actually replaced with X-rays. And so they're X-raying the 3-dimensional structure of the bivouac as it actually forms. And these are incredibly difficult experiments to do. I just put the rest of the video here so you can see some of the messy aspects of it, which is it's really hard to collect ants from a bivouac, and it's really hard to find them. But I really think that with this combination of scientists, engineers, we can now have new insights through vision, through X-rays, through more and more sort of technology, get a much more detailed vision of how these ants are operating, and really have new insights into biology that we couldn't have had before. All right. So what can thousands of individuals do together as a collective? I think perhaps the most important and critical piece of this is that we can do science together. So everything that I've told you so far is itself the result of collective intelligence. And for me, I think what was really exciting about this collective intelligence was really how interdisciplinary it was. So I've told you the story of 5 people. Some of us are roboticists, some of us are computer scientists, some of us are biologists by training. But by working together, we could definitely achieve much more than the sum of our parts. And of course, have a great deal of collective fun. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Yeah, thanks. A big round of applause for Radhika. So it's a very nice talk. Thanks a lot. As mentioned at the beginning, we do the questions by the Q&A button of Zoom. So please type your questions here. It's a bit impersonal, so I will read the questions so at least you hear some voice. So please do it now. I already have a few questions while people are doing this. So first of all, wonderful talk. I really love your work. So it's really exciting to see all this. My first question is about homogeneity or heterogeneity in the swarm. So here, intuitively, I would say for this ants, it would make sense to maybe have some strong guys doing different behaviors from the weak guys. Do you see that, or are these kind of all these ants quite similar to each other?
Yeah. So actually, the fun part of this project, especially with the work that Helen is doing, is that we are tracking the types of ants. And so you actually can look at this question. And army ants have, of course, they are heterogeneous. So there's the major workers, or they're the workers, which are most of the population, but you also have these really large soldiers, which you might have seen in the middle of the videos that sort of come along. And you also have some really tiny ones, which actually can't cross the gaps. So it seems that the behavior is pretty uniform, or mostly done by this majority sort of middle-sized ant in this case. The soldiers do sometimes cooperate, but I think that they have a purpose, and that's to defend the colony. And so they actually are not seen that often stuck in the bridge itself. But you can see cases where, you know, the gap is large and the tiny ones can't get across and the medium ones get across, or a soldier gets across and ends up getting stepped on. So my thought process is that, you know, and this goes back to work that, you know, was done. I remember sort of papers by Bonobo and Theralas in this space and de Newborg, that there might be sort of a task threshold. So maybe the medium ones are always joining the bridge, but the soldiers are not likely to join the bridge unless their threshold is exceeded, and then they do. And the small ones don't cooperate very well. It's kind of hard for them anyways. Mm-hmm. So there might be just different thresholds based on the caste that you belong to. And so here people tend to treat it as a homogeneous system, but in reality, we're just focusing mainly on the middle-sized ant. That is itself like 2 to 3 millimeters. Okay,
yeah. And I guess for robotics application, depending on what you want to do, being heterogeneous can be either complicated because you then need to have like specialized rules, or can be a benefit. So more from a robotics point of view, what's your intuition? When should we have heterogeneity and when not?
Well, I think that the army ants are a great model for this, because you clearly have these different castes, and they actually play different roles in your swarm. So I think as we try to start thinking about swarms that are doing more than one thing, we would automatically want to do heterogeneity. And I think the Swarmoids project was one example of looking at this, and there are other projects with aerial robots and ground robots. In that case, we're thinking, okay, there are different environments and I can't make one robot do all environments. But I really think when we start to think of multiple tasks, so the reason the soldier robot is so large is that it defends the colony. So it has a shape, it has pinchers, and actually, even as we interfere with this system, we're always keeping track of them, because when they pinch you, it really hurts. It's really, really, you know, and they will dig in and they won't let go, and you basically have to kill them.
Oh, wow.
So there's sort of a sacrificial quality also to them. So you can think that in the future, we might create robots that have specialized hardware for a task. And then some tasks, maybe we can use task-based thresholds. And in other tasks, you know, we basically can use only one kind of robot. But I really think that we have to cross this barrier where we're trying to make a robot swarm that does many things. And then it really become exciting to have heterogeneity.
Yeah, super. Yeah. I hope the Q&A works. I don't see any questions. Either people are shy or there's a problem with the Q&A.
It's okay. I also gave a long talk with lots of pieces. So
can somebody just drop something on the Q&A just to see if it works, just to check? In the meanwhile, I have another question about the modeling, because I love this hysteresis that you noticed in the system. I would expect if you have a time delay in the reaction of in the rules of how people make, how you made the local rules. If you have a time delay, I would expect you have some hysteresis in the model. That you didn't see hysteresis in the model yet?
No, actually, so time delay is like the first one that you might expect. And it also sort of is a little bit how we observe the system. So you could make lots of adjustments to the bridge and you would see nothing happen. And then all of a sudden, a lot of things would happen. So what we really see is sort of, we call them upheavals. We don't see just a delayed smooth reaction. And so we did some simulations, and the simple sort of delay model doesn't actually produce hysteresis. I mean, it does, but it produces hysteresis in the wrong direction. So we actually produced several models that we thought made sense, and then we ran them, and the hysteresis was completely not what we expected. So that was actually, at the time, very disturbing. And now in retrospect, actually quite fun, because it has allowed us to look at the models. So you need some non-linearity. That's one thing that is happening here, is that the response cannot be linear.
Okay.
And that's really what we're observing we need in the models in order to create hysteresis in the correct direction.
Okay, yeah, very good. Yeah, so I'm glad. I see questions now. Somebody on the chat mentioned he or she could not, but at least I see questions appearing on the Q&A. So let's start with the Q&A.
Great.
One nice question from Shravan, who asked, do ants ever form parallel bridges next to each other?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that it depends on the trail. And so typically the army ants and the trails tend to become coherent over time. So if you see two trails, they will tend to merge and straighten. And there's really cool mathematical models of how this straightening might occur. So there is a sense in which, so they're laying pheromones on these trails. And so it is a little bit bistable to have two bridges nearby each other, or two trails nearby each other, so they tend to collapse. But if you actually create congestion on one trail, so that they're having difficulty, you'll immediately see ants leave the trail and try to form an alternate trail. And so for short periods of time, you might have multiple paths being explored. And the army ants will make, you know, the terrain that we saw in Panama, there are leaves and debris all over the floor. So they're constantly making bridges. And bridges, they're very hard to photograph, but you just constantly see something that goes between being a trail and being a bridge in almost a flexible fashion. So so you can, but not lots of times I don't see actually parallel bridges or parallel trails.
Yeah. There are two more questions, and then I suggest we are almost time up. And by the way, all these ant algorithms, they are very good optimization algorithms with pheromones and everything that are surprisingly good in terms of optimization.
Yeah,
so
they
it's a bit
are.
related to that. Yeah. But that was not the question. So let me switch. One question.
Okay.
Is one of your lab presentation slides, you showed some bees. Are you doing bee-related research or projects?
I'm not. So in the past, I was part of the RoboBee. I'm not currently. In the past, I was part of the RoboBee project, where we were really inspired by task allocation algorithms in bees and by foraging algorithms in bees. And Rob Wood's group was really trying to create small robots, and my lab was working on aerial robots. I don't do that anymore, but Kirsten Peterson, my former student who's now at Cornell, is actually actively working on the collective behavior of bees. And she started working with Seeley's group there. So, you know, her research in that area is really exciting. And they're looking at other kinds of regulatory behavior. So bees, you know, we classically think of task allocation and foraging, but they also regulate the temperature of the hive. And that's also a self-organized behavior that has a big element of physics in it as well. And so her group is also excited about soft robots and the interplay of physics and collective behavior. So that's the area that they're focusing on.
Okay, yeah, super. And so a question by Nicolas Bredesh. He asked, do you think the abstract model of a flipping robot you use might be missing some critical physical properties of the interaction between the robots and the environment? In other words, while the dynamics might look the same between simulation and real experiments, is there a risk of missing a critical aspect in the physical interaction? So I guess it's between the real robot and the simulation, right. But we could then even extend maybe to a real animal. But I think the question mainly simulation and real robot.
Yeah, I think that there's quite likely things that we're missing. I don't know if it will change the high level outcomes. Like it might change the details of the dynamics. It might change some of the details in the phase space. But, you know, I don't know how it will change in the large scale. But right now, part of our reason for having multiple hardware robots is that we want to understand in what ways does the simulation not model our robots. And we already have several differences between the two, which is why I think we still have some problems with our robots. So one is we modeled our flipping robots to flip. So they flip and they stay, and then they flip and they stay, and most of the time is in the flipping. In our real robots, most of the time is actually in the attachment. The flipping is super fast, and then getting a good grip on the surface is really long. So that's one difference. But because of that, our robots actually don't move as uniformly as the other robots. So when we do experiments with two robots, sometimes they don't collide and sometimes they do. And that just depends on the speed, which is not uniform of each robot. It depends on how long it took to get a good grip on the surface. So there are some differences, and you know, in the future, we can start to explore how these differences will affect things and customize these simulations to other things. But I think even if you just take the simulated robot for its own self, let me actually show you a picture. I think I have a picture of this. If you take the simulated model by itself, trying to see where the image is. All right, here we go. If you can see this image of Mike and the bivouac. So Mike's group, they actually designed a robot that is a direct mimic of the simulation. So they were inspired by the simulation of flipping robots with two sort of circular halves. And so they made a two circular half robot that moves by flipping and actually joins with rigid joints by thermoplastic melting. So now we actually have a robot that is directly modeled after the simulation. That was not what I expected. And it's also actually rigid. So even though it's forming amorphous structures, not lattice structures, it's actually making purely, it's not even having compliant joints. So I think there's just many different physical interpretations that are going to happen. And it will be interesting to see how this affects, like, are there cases where if your attachment is too weak, you can't build bridges at all? That maybe seems like an obvious case where the physics of the simulation would, the physics of the hardware or the physics of the simulation would change things. But I'm hopeful that to some extent, because of this relationship with jamming physics, that we might be onto something that actually is more general and that can be generalized across granular material and could be generalized across self-assembling systems. I'm hopeful. But yeah, it's a really good question how much of the details are going to change between different systems. And we're still trying to figure that out.
So wonderful. So there were a few more questions, but I think we have to close up here. Thanks so much, Radhika, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who was present and asked good questions. And I hope to see you on the campus soon again. It would be nice to have some beers here once the chance is there again. So
yes,
thanks a lot so much. Maybe Radhika, just say a few 5 minutes for debriefing, but we will close the session to everyone. So have a good end of the day for everyone. And Jan, you can maybe say when's the next talk? I don't remember.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. That's really great. I also would like to thank all attendees. Thanks for being with us today. The next talk is going to be on October 26th. This is going to be Ms. Firth Butterfield, who is the head of AI and machine learning, member of the executive committee at the World Economic Forum. Please follow us on our website and Instagram and Twitter if you want to get our latest news. Otherwise, have a great day. It's great seeing you all today for the seminar and hope to see you in October again. Bye.
Bye.